Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. For this ranking, I'm going to be looking at the expanded universe and collective multimedia around each Final Fantasy game, and ranking them based on how good the game's expanded universe is. Some games have incredible tertiary media that greatly expands upon the themes of the game and makes the original experience richer and more meaningful, but other games have sequels and spin-offs that are so terrible that the original is hurt by their association. This is a list that will generally favor games with sequels, but not always. This is obviously a category that factors in expansion packs for the MMOs, and this video will contain spoilers for not just the base games, but the spin-off media as well. Now that we've gotten the housekeeping out of the way, let's get into this ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V's universe is one of the more boring ones in the main series. The world of the base game isn't particularly interesting compared to the other games in the series, and the movie, Legend of the Crystals, didn't add anything to Final Fantasy V's world to make it any more interesting. The film was actually pretty terrible. It felt wholly unrelated to Final Fantasy V in almost every way, and honestly, all the panty shots were really gross. I really don't like this movie, and it brings down a game that, while good, is already one of the weaker ones in the series. Sure, the remakes of 5 added some new content with a little extra world building, but it's not enough to counteract the abysmal film. Because the expanded universe content is actively bad, and the original universe wasn't much to talk about in the first place, Final Fantasy V easily ranks last place in this ranking. Number 15, Final Fantasy VII. I love Final Fantasy VII and its world. It's perfectly constructed, and if we were just talking about the original game, this would rank much higher on my ranking of the games in their expanded universes. But the compilation of Final Fantasy VII is terrible. While I can enjoy some of it in the way I enjoy reading bad fanfiction, none of it is good, and everything in the compilation just undermines the original Final Fantasy VII and makes it worse and worse. Genesis, Emo Cloud, Dirge of Cerberus. None of it is good. Sure, Zack is an endearing character in Crisis Core, but basically everything else is hot garbage that just undermines the brilliant original game at every turn and tarnishes its reputation. I will admit that Remake was actually able to redeem the Final Fantasy VII universe a bit, and impressively, it was able to take compilation elements and not make them terrible. However, when you look at the Final Fantasy VII universe as a whole, most of it is absolute garbage, and as a fan of the original game, it pains me to rank 7's universe so low, but sadly 7's expanded universe actively hurts the game. The only reason 7's universe ranks above 5's universe is because 7 is a much better game than 5. But the dumpster fire of the compilation still forces me to rank 7's expanded universe towards the bottom of this list. Number 14, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X-2, story-wise, is not a good follow-up to Final Fantasy X, but there are more positives to it than the previous entries on this list. For one, the cultural changes in Spira is actually something that makes some coherent sense when it comes to narrative world building. One can see how the destruction of Sin and fall of that world's major religious and political institutions would lead to a more happy, carefree, and less conservative culture. That all makes logical sense, and Spira still feels like the same world between the games, but the tone of X-2 is just a hair too goofy, and the vibe is off. The video games in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII were generally bad, as were the movies, but X-2, for all its faults, is generally considered to have really good gameplay. Last Mission is also generally considered to be pretty fun. And the audio dramas aren't terrible story-wise. They're not great either, but they're not compilation bad. X-2 is a mixed bag story-wise, but it's not a total train wreck, like every plot in the compilation. X-2 doesn't actively make 10 better, and it actually drags down the original game ever so slightly, but the expanded universe of 10 doesn't ruin the original game as much as the expanded universe content of 5 and 7. Number 13, Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII has basically no expanded universe content, so it literally has nothing to drag it down like the previous entries, which had content that actively brought down the original game's quality. VIII's world is fun, but it feels like there's a lot missing from it. There's a lot of lore that's just buried beneath the surface and not fully addressed, really making you feel like they had a lot more planned for the game, even had time to put the assets in, but then just didn't have enough time to do some cutscenes explaining what's going on with all the weird things in VIII's universe that don't quite feel like they make coherent sense. Number 12, Final Fantasy VI. Like Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy VI has basically no expanded universe to speak of, aside from a brief manga adaptation that was never released in English. But VI's world history, lore, and general structure of its universe is a lot more coherent than Final Fantasy VIII's more haphazard hot mess. VI's world is far more fleshed out and logical, so for that reason, it ranks above VIII's expanded universe. Number 11, Final Fantasy IX. Again, we have another game with little to no tertiary media to speak of like the previous two entries on this list, and really, when choosing between these three games, it's mostly a matter of personal preference. For me, 9 does a better job of fleshing out individual locations than 6 does, and I find the lore more interesting. So that's why I ultimately decided to give it the number 11 spot. It's another game that's not dragged down by a bad expanded universe, but it's not brought up by a good one either. Number 10, Final Fantasy I. For the most part, Final Fantasy I didn't have much in terms of interesting expanded universe content outside of the main game, other than the Warrior of Light acting as a mascot, until Stranger of Paradise. And while Stranger of Paradise has a lot of problems, I think it actually makes Final Fantasy I better. Final Fantasy I's story wasn't super great in the first place, so making a cheesy, unintentionally hilarious edgelord dark remake doesn't feel like a travesty, and is able to elevate the original game by offering a fun new interpretation of its events. It's not necessarily canon to Final Fantasy I, but a fun Elseworlds take, like that time Superman was a communist. And since Stranger Paradise is actually legit fun in its silliness, it doesn't actively hurt its expanded universe. Final Fantasy I is the first game on this list with an actual expanded universe to be ranked favorably. Final Fantasy I's expanded universe passes the low bar of actually having an expanded universe and it not being actively terrible, or rather, it's at least actively entertaining. Number 9, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII's expanded universe is an incoherent mess that constantly escalates to new heights of epicness and ridiculousness. The world of Final Fantasy XIII goes through so much change in between the games where it ends up sounding absolutely insane on paper when you try to write it out, and makes the saga of the 13-verse feel more akin to old-school mythology than a modern, intelligently designed narrative. Okay, these crystal entities are making you their slave. Now it's time for time travel. Oh, Enlighten is now a servant of the goddess. Okay, now it's hundreds of years later and everyone is immortal. Except when they're not. And God is going to reset existence just cause, so you need to save some souls before the apocalypse. The 13-verse is bonkers, and when I read the Wikipedia plot descriptions of the games prior to playing, I thought the 13 sequels would be hot garbage in terms of story, and would feel out of place and weird. The original Final Fantasy XIII ended very definitively, and definitely did not need a sequel. But somehow, 13 made those bonkers sequels work, and they didn't take anything away from the original like the compilation did. They didn't necessarily make the original better, but they were all interesting and they all worked in their own little ways. When you add in Type 0, which is also part of the 13-verse as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series, you realize you've actually got 4 pretty decent games that all stand on their own pretty well, and the scale ends up tipping towards the positive because of this. Stranger of Paradise may have actively enhanced its original game more than 13's spin-offs, but it wasn't as good as the games in the Fabula Nova Crystallis series, and thus 13's wild and wacky universe is able to defeat Final Fantasy I's expanded universe in this ranking. Number 8, Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III doesn't have any spin-offs or sequels, but it does have a big expansion to the original game in the form of the 3D remake, which overall added a lot to Final Fantasy III's universe. Fans are able to have their own headcanon as to who the lead character of Final Fantasy III truly is, the nameless Onion Knight, or Luneth, the adventurous boy from who went on to save the world from darkness. Final Fantasy III's remake added a different lens to view the game, with new characters and story that fit in well with the original, but are different enough to have their own identity. Do you like chocolate or strawberry? There's room to like both in the world of Final Fantasy III, and the fact that Square Enix flip-flops pretty often over which version they prefer to promote only adds to a legitimization of both the 3D and pixelated versions of the game. Both versions of 3's story are great in their own way, and don't detract from one another. So despite not having a traditional expanded universe of content, the 3D remake adds enough to 3's universe to rank it here on this list. Number 7, Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II does have a pretty interesting novelization that changes events from the game pretty significantly, and adds some additional lore. But what really seals the deal for Final Fantasy II securing the number 7 spot on this list is Soul of Rebirth. Soul of Rebirth is a midquel added to Final Fantasy II in later editions of the game that adds a great extra layer to the story and makes the narrative feel more complete. Unlike a lot of expanded universe content, this extra scenario fits into the original game like a glove. It doesn't feel out of place, enhances what was there before, and is great on its own. This is exactly what you want from expanded universe content. Something that fits in with the world and makes the original even better. Number 6, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV was originally titled Final Fantasy Versus 13, and was to be part of 13's expanded universe. After years of development, the game was rebranded to Final Fantasy XV, and became its own thing completely separate from the mythology and world of the 13 games. A core part of 15's design was building an expanded universe around the base game, but instead of purely making sequels or having some other games with a shared mythos, 15's shared universe was intended to act as their prime method of delivering the game's story to the player. Instead of 15's story being purely contained within the base game, it was to be spread out across other forms of multimedia, with the intended effect to enhance the narrative and make it feel far more grand than the simple video game. The Matrix franchise largely tried the same thing in the early 2000s, so why not Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy XV's expanded universe has the main game, Final Fantasy XV, and also an anime, a full-length CG movie, a beat-em-up side-scroller game, a mobile strategy game, a VR fishing game, 5 different DLC scenarios for different characters, a multiplayer midquel, new content added to later editions of the game, seasonal events, crossovers with games like Final Fantasy XIV, Terra Battle, and Assassin's Creed, and a full-length sequel novel to the game called Dawn of the Future that offers 15's quote-unquote true ending. Final Fantasy XV was designed from the ground up to be part of a multimedia expanded universe. The results of this approach? The main game suffers from this in that if you play the game by itself, you will feel like you're missing significant chunks of the story and it feels rather incomplete. The flip side of this, however, is that most of 15's multimedia is actually pretty good and works really well. Obviously, 15 was stretched too thin by this approach, and it would have been far better if Square redirected the resources used to create the tertiary media towards the game instead, as the quality would likely have been significantly improved. However, when you do take the time to consume all of 15's tertiary media, it does lead to an incredibly satisfying experience that ends up making 15's universe one of the better ones in the Final Fantasy series, and when combined together, one of the better Final Fantasy stories. While it would have been better to put more focus into the actual game, the extra content fits in with the universe well, enhances the world and characters, and helps 15 feel more complete. Number 5, Final Fantasy IV. I absolutely adore the original Final Fantasy IV, and when I first heard about its sequel, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, I was immediately skeptical. After the compilation in 10.2, I had basically zero faith in Square making a good sequel to a mainline game, especially a game from so long ago with so little of the staff remaining in the company. I figured the vibe of the game would be totally different, lacking the heart and spirit of the original, and it would do nothing other than degrade the original 4. I was completely and totally wrong. When The After Years was originally released, it was heavily criticized for having an episodic release structure, but playing all of the chapters packaged as a single game is a joy. Unlike Final Fantasy IV, which has a completely linear path, Final Fantasy IV The After Years allows you to pick a character and play through their individual scenario, which interconnects with other character chapters. It's fun seeing how all the chapters weave together, and after you beat all of the character chapters, the entire cast unites for the final chapters of the game. I actually really like the structure, and it's a lot of fun to play through, as each scenario offers its own unique challenges based on the party setup, just like the original 4. Story-wise, it's great. Takashi Tokita, the original scenario writer for 4, is the one who headed the After Years, and the game has the same storytelling spirit as the original, but it also offers plenty of new things to enjoy. Seeing how characters from the original game have changed over the years is a treat, and we see actual character progression and growth, but they still feel like those same characters we came to grow and love. In particular, I love adult Palom and Porom, and seeing how much they've grown since they were little kids, the ways in which they've changed, and the way they now interact with one another. You treat your sister very differently when you're 5 than when you're 17, and it's great to see that play out in the game. Edward's growth into a competent tactician and ruler full of resolve was also great to see, as was seeing the characters who have become parents interacting with their children, and those children are great characters in their own right. The world feels consistent in relation to Base 4, and the new story fits in perfectly with the tone and vibe of the original. I found out when researching the game that Square had no plans for a sequel to 4, but Tokita had an idea for a story and pitched it to Square, and that's why the sequel was greenlit. It wasn't the higher-ups at the company asking for a game to be made, but rather the creator of the original story feeling passionate about his characters and having another story to tell. It's clear Tokita really loves the world, story, and characters of 4, and he does them justice by keeping the spirit of the original alive. There are other aspects of 4's expanded universe that are great in their own way aside from the After Years. Final Fantasy IV Interlude is a nice short 4-hour RPG that serves as a bridge between OG Final Fantasy IV and the After Years, and the 3D remake added some nice story aspects to 4 and cleaned up other parts nicely to make them more coherent. But 4's expanded universe ranks so highly because of how great the original game is and how great the After Years is. It's a worthy sequel to Final Fantasy IV and one of the most underrated games in the series. Number 4, Final Fantasy XII. Number 3, Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy Tactics get the number 3 and 4 spots since they're technically both part of the same expanded universe. XII and Tactics both take place in the world of Ivalice, but I've never really been sold on the concept if I'm being honest. I personally feel like XII and Tactics are so drastically different, I consider them to be basically completely different worlds, but I know I'm in the minority on that. The lack of shared locations, architectural style, general thematic style, similar races, technology, culture, etc. made them feel as different as Final Fantasy IV and VI to me, but they're both part of the Ivalice Alliance, so it makes sense to discuss them together. Final Fantasy XII is interesting because unlike other mainline Final Fantasy titles, its expanded universe existed before it did, in the form of Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and Vagrant Story. Though I like Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, the game led to a tonal shift in the universe that moved things in a lighter and more eccentric direction. Everything that came out after Advance, 12, Tactics A2, and Revenant Wings all fit into a particular style and feel like part of a shared universe with tonal and visual consistency, while the two games that came out before Advance, Tactics and Vagrant Story, stick out from the rest of the games like a sore thumb. It really feels like there are two Ivalices, with Tactics Advance serving as the dividing line. However, each individual game in this series is generally good. I haven't beaten Vagrant Story or Revenant Wings, but I've beaten all of the other Ivalice games, and they're generally excellent games with good stories, good casts, and fantastic visuals. Yes, I'm not as hot on 12 as other games in the franchise, but I still think it's one of the greatest video games of all time, and all of the Tactics games are quite excellent. Ivalice is beloved by fans of the series, and for good reasons. It's a rich world full of interesting characters, locales, and great games. Aside from a brief cameo in Final Fantasy XIV, Ivalice has mostly lied dormant, but hopefully this universe can be revived with future installments, because it is really great. Number 2, Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI takes place in the world of Vana'diel, a rich fantasy setting full of stunning locales, memorable characters, and deep, rich lore. Though Vana'diel comes second place in the ranking, it still wins the award for the name of a world that sounds the most like a random made-up fantasy world. Seriously, I love the Final Fantasy games, but I feel so nerdy just freaking saying Vana'diel out loud. That said, the expanded universe of 11 is absolutely amazing. This is another category where the nature of the game being an MMO serves to its advantage. Final Fantasy XI has over 20 years worth of expansion packs and add-on content. Each new expansion is basically the length of a full-length mainline Final Fantasy game, with a story and scale to match. But it's not just adding some fun new adventures to Vana'diel's world. The expansions add richness to a world that feels like it already exists, and you're just getting to explore a new part of it, the way you hear about a country overseas and then are finally able to take a visit. The expansions have great new stories and locations to explore. They feel like they add to the world of 11 in such a way where the game only continues to get better and better. Nothing feels out of place and weird like the expanded universe content of 7 and 13. No, even as the culture and history of Vana'diel ever expands over the course of 20 plus years, everything feels consistent, belonging to part of the same world while also being fresh and interesting. That's an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk, but 11 does it brilliantly, and has been doing so for more than 2 decades. Final Fantasy XI's expansions feature some of the best content in the entire Final Fantasy series, and there is so much of it to dig into. While a lot of games in the series have large expanded universes, a lot of it isn't very good, and 11's expanded universe content competes with the best of the mainline entries. Everything that 11 adds only continues to improve and expand upon its world, and it's an easy second place on this list. Number 1, Final Fantasy XIV. Basically everything I said about 11 applies here. No other game in the series builds upon its world through additional content as brilliantly as Final Fantasy XIV does, and you will regularly hear fans of the series say that 14, when taken as a whole, is the best Final Fantasy game, because no other game in the series can compete with its narrative scope and how it keeps building upon itself. Even 14's bad content, like the original 1.0 version, makes the game better. What was once a bad video game became a legend and myth, the kind of thing you want to seek out on YouTube to get even more story for the world of 14. 14, more than 11, is really good at adding stuff from other games in the series, offers sprinklings of fan service to further enhance their massive and progressive build of its world. So, not only does the world and story get better and better, building into arguably the grandest narrative in the series, and continuing to improve upon itself, it also has so many fun Easter eggs from other games that it almost acts as a culmination of the entire series. 9 does this excellently as well, but 9 doesn't have sequels, whereas 14's expansion sequels get better and better, at least according to fans. I've yet to play them all myself, because I wanted to get this video series out before 16, and according to the Word doc of the script for this series, these videos, in text form, are the length of a decent-sized fantasy novel. So it's still possible that I might put 11 at the top of this list when all is said and done, but based on everything I've heard and read about 14, and from what I've experienced, It seems to have the best expanded universe of content and is worthy of the #1 spot on this list. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!